Nanapua o Hawaii Pupa'a hope o ka'ai.
Aloha. I am Poka Laenui. My friend here is Dr. Keoni Duddly. Welcome to the Sovereignty Conversation. We are going to be talking about things that is happening, and we're trying to, I guess, instigate activity at the United Nations.
Yes.
And trying to get some remedy for injustices that we have observed. Brother Keoni and I and Leon Seal has been trying to take a look at the situation. And what we're going to do is begin with Dr. Keoni Duddly with a brief introduction of himself. And you will see some of the books that he has written on the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty. And in your introduction, why don't you tell us a little bit about those books, and then we'll get into the subject of what is happening at the United Nations, what can happen, what can be the future of Hawaii in relationship to the United States and relationship to the rest of the world.
Okay. First off, the book you're referring to is called "CALL for Hawaiian Sovereignty." Mm-hmm. I co-authored that with Keoni back in we published it in 1990. So it's been around for a while.
Yeah,
so, yeah. Let me tell you that that book is out of print, and I want to get it back into print. But I've learned so much since then. In 1990 we knew nothing. I mean, you had done so much research, and I profited so much from your research in writing the book. We were just beginning to do other things. I mean, the sovereignty movement was just getting off the ground, and since that time, we've discovered the Kuwait petition. I mentioned that in my book, but we'd never seen it. We had no idea what it was like. We've gone back and we found out so much more about Queen Liliuokalani and what she did in the years after the overthrow, and her efforts on the mainland and so forth, trying to get the Congress to come around. We've come to a much greater understanding of the Congress itself, and how some of those guys were really staunchly for us, and and they were not about to let annexation take place, and then we've become so much more aware of the way that the whole annexation thing was so fake. So preposterous, and illegal. And then the big thing, though, is the work we've been doing with Leon in the last many months on statehood and the statehood vote. And so I'm hoping that tonight we can share some of that statehood vote preposterous activity with the television audience.
Let me reflect back on some of the stuff that you just mentioned. We are recording this in October. Today's the 6th day of October. There's a big vote occurring in the U.S. Congress that has essentially split the nation between whether or not one person should be seated in the U.S. Supreme Court or not. And that seems to have attracted so much attention that people are talking about, will there be a united country ever again? Mm-hmm. Well, the discussions that had occurred in 1897, 1898, that division of whether or not the United States should continue its aggression into the Pacific and start grabbing other places such as Hawaii, as you had said earlier, was such a major breach, a major disagreement. The Congress itself was split. Mm. They had debates at universities, Harvard versus Yale or some other universities, and there were a lot of debates going on, and generally the debates were won on the side of leaving Hawaii alone. So at that time, the consciousness were so intense, so great. The discussion, the issue of the Hawaii story, as they called it, was really at the forefront of the United States.
Yeah.
And yet how quickly they have forgotten. Well, maybe not so quickly because it's been over 100 years since that time. So it wasn't really a foregone conclusion, or sometimes when we look back at that history, we conclude that, oh, these Americans, they all wanted to take Hawaii. That's not necessarily the case.
That's right. Yeah, and our people need to know that. You know? And not just the Hawaiian community. I mean, the people of Hawaii need to know that that there really was great concern about this, and that many Americans, probably the majority of Americans, were opposed. You know, and so all Hawaii stand together. I mean, let's do it.
It seemed like those people who had power at that time, and they were coincidentally the Republican Party, decided no, they're just going to plow ahead and they're going to grab Hawaii.
Yeah.
Because not only did they want to grab Hawaii, but they wanted to grab other areas in the Pacific and stretch out into Asia. So that was part of the general plan. While others, such as Grover Cleveland and his group, said no, let's stop at the borders, and let's stop this idea of manifest destiny giving us a right to stretch not only across all of the continental U.S., but into Central and South America using the Monroe Doctrine. And now we want to even expand it. Where does it end? So there was that very broad debate, and we have been essentially victimized with the outcome of that debate.
Yeah.
So different perspectives, as you say, over a different period of time.
Yeah. We, the period from annexation up to statehood, we never knew very much about that period either.
It's sort of like the Dark Ages.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I don't think that it strikes home harshly enough that the missionary children really did cause the whole overthrow. And it was all for their own economic advantage. And, they became the Big Five. And, and they ruled the land for decades and decades and decades. And during that time, they were so American and pro-American. This whole school system was destroyed. The whole idea of Hawaiian culture, it was put in the bottom place. I remember when I started teaching at Nanakuli, I was only there for 1 year. But this was 1988, and I said and there was nothing in the school that was Hawaiian. That the culture just gone, And the only thing they had was one Hawaiian language class, and he would put a word on the board every day.
That was it.
That was it.
In Nanakuli.
In Nanakuli, yeah. It was only 97% Hawaiian kids in school. and so I said to one of the teachers one time, she was teaching Greek mythology, and I said, can you at all teach a little bit about Hawaiian history? And she says, these people have to learn to be Americans. She says, the problem with them is they're never going to get ahead until they're Americans. And that was the belief of people,
Let's stop at that point and backtrack, because I don't want you to put the other foot in your mouth.
Okay, all right.
When you say that the missionaries, the children of the missionaries, are really responsible and need to sort of be called upon. It's not your words, I'm paraphrasing.
I like that.
I think to a certain extent that's true, but I cannot say that it's a full statement of missionary, children of missionaries in Hawaii, because you had some who refused to go along They could see what was happening. It's not only the children, but you can start with the missionaries themselves. They had a very strict code that they were not to engage in politics and economics of the country. They were to stay within the pulpits of the church. So it was a prohibition that the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions had instructed them to do. And yet, as Hawaii continued to integrate with the rest of the world, some of the alii of Hawaii, the leaders of Hawaii, tried to encourage them to come over to the government side and take leadership there. So you saw the, what do you call it, attrition, but they also jumped into the economic side. They started picking up land and the rest. So the strict code of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Mission was not retained. You also had this very interesting missionary, and I think his story is reflective of some of the other missionaries, and that was a missionary named Andrews. And he, in fact, wrote the first Hawaiian dictionary, and they assigned him to Lahaina Luna. And so he was teaching at the school in Lahaina Luna. And what was he teaching? He was teaching Hawaiian children how to become historians. And many of the Hawaiian historians, the early Hawaiian historians, were taught by him. He discovered that American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Mission was receiving funds from slave states to send these missionaries to Hawaii. Hawaii was the first mission that they were sent to. And what he said was that he would not continue to serve as a missionary and receive those funds. What normally would happen is that missionaries, when they left the mission, would return back to the United States. But in his case, he did not do that. He said that there was still the obligation to continue. So he remained in Hawaii, and he continued teaching. And then he was asked to lead the Department of Education that the nation was creating. So he then jumped out of that position and became the leader of the Department of Education, developing the education system. So you have that as an example of a missionary who held true to his sense of appropriateness, of Christian righteousness, I guess you could call it. But he wasn't the son and daughter, as you had said, the sons and daughters of missionaries to be responsible. Where do you find the name Andrews pop out again?
I don't know. Where?
Lauren Andrews Thurston. So yes, the grandfather is
Really?
So if you look at it from your statement, you can say, here you go, it proves Keoni's point that it was the sons and daughters or descendants of these missionaries.
Yeah.
And yet, Thurston and Thurston Twiggsmith, his brothers and sisters, they are not necessarily in line with his thoughts. They are more quiet and the rest. So it's hard to just say that because you can trace one person and his tie into missionaries, you can reach that broad conclusion. It's just whole idea of generalization. I think we need to be careful with. It's the same. I was reading in Facebook, they were talking about all these damn Howleys who keep calling the Hawaiians racist, and we weren't racist. It was when they first came and the way they treated us, and so it was a huge exclamation about these dirty, rotten Howleys. And so I wrote back and I said, well, yeah, I agree totally with you folks, these dirty, rotten Howleys. And yet I can see how I am blinded by that generalization because I don't take the time to distinguish and to discriminate. And failing to do that, yes, I am a racist. And so we need to be more discreet in our broad statement.
Okay.
Huh?
All right.
Anyway, that's my view. None of you have taken so much time.
Good. I hope we are going to have this statehood discussion here.
Well, I think it's important. It's not necessarily statehood discussion, but you know the discussion of Hawaiian sovereignty?
Mm-hmm.
Hawaiian sovereignty needs to be seen, the discussion of Hawaiian sovereignty needs to be seen as far more than just the historical events that have occurred. But it also should include the analysis of our society, how we think, how we treat one another, how we treat the environment, the land policy issues, and all that stuff. So I just taking this opportunity to throw that in.
Good. Now, in the next 45 minutes. So, what we wanted to talk about then was, you know, the problems with the statehood vote. And then we've come up with about 5 major problems with the statehood vote. And I'm sure you'll get a chance to amplify a lot of this. But the first of the problems is the wrong people voted. Now, and that's something that you've talked about a lot in the past. You know, you talk about the what is the word that you use?
Self-determination, the altered self.
Yeah, and the altered self. Okay, but I want to try to get away from that word self right now and just talk about, you know, the United Nations. The whole setup was that. And it started with the Charter, and it started with Article 73, and it started with the idea that there are countries in the world, there were many countries in the world at that time, who had many territories, and that they had obligations to the people in those territories. And the obligation was to put those people first, and to treat those people carefully, so that their culture would be preserved, and so that they would be given education, and so that they would be given treated in such a way that they would prosper while the larger nation was occupying them, and that they would prepare them for statehood. I mean that's all in the United Nations Charter, and specifically in Article 73. There also is so if they're going to be prepared for the possibility of having their independence again, I mean that's the whole idea. And we find and after the Charter later on we find that there are other commissions and other the places where the United Nations votes that specifically when they are given a chance to vote on nationhood, and when they're ready to assume a full self-determination, okay, that independence will be a real part of the discussion. And the UN, there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution which says, you know, that you must mention independence in that.
Before we get into that, let me just take 1 or 2 steps back.
Okay.
And give an imagery so that people can understand what was happening in 1946, 1945. They had just fought a war basically focusing in on 2 countries, but more than that. One was Germany and its incursion into other countries, especially Europe. The other was Japan and its incursion into Asia under this doctrine of Asia for the Asians. And the idea of invading into the province of the right of other people to determine their future, their determination. The winners of the war in 1945, they started this discussion in 43, 44, 45. They said there needs to be an established new world order. that people should have the right to be free to determine their own destiny. We cannot allow countries in the future to act like Germany or like Japan. And so we need to create this new world order. And so they created the United Nations because the League of Nations had essentially failed to prevent that Second World War. And so that was a sort of the euphoria that they were so determined to respect the integrity of all people to make that decision. So the stuff that you are talking about now, how they created the United Nations, they created the Article 73, just in the Charter of the United Nations, it talks about the right of self-governance, the right of self-determination. So that is heavily loaded up in the United Nations organization. But how was it to be carried out? And that is where you were just about getting into.
Okay, and so the idea of decolonization, we got to realize that the United Nations was big on let's start decolonizing. And now, if we look at the United Nations, 3/4 of the nations in the United Nations are former colonies,
Mm-hmm.
and so the United Nations has been a great success in all cases except where America was the colonizer.
No, there's still some others.
Oh yeah, okay,
Besides
there are a
the-
few others, but I mean,
France has continued to hold on to their colonies as well.
yeah, that's true, and and there are a few others, but one does have to say though that as far as where America was concerned, the United Nations just kind of turned their head and allowed things to happen that just were not true. Now let's get back to this idea of the self and who voted, and let's realize that when America took over the territory of Hawaii, we became a non-self-governing territory, just like all these other guys. We became a colony, just like these other guys, and it was the people who were the descendants of the kingdom that were the people that were of concern to the United Nations. The descendants of the people of the kingdom, the descendants of the subjects of the kingdom. That in ordinary circumstances, you would find that that's the people who are living today in a country, but not so Hawaii. And in Hawaii, there was this big move, as you've talked about manifest destiny, and the people, they may have resisted it, but they began to move to Hawaii, and the military began to take over and bring in thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and the World War II took place, and there are thousands, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of military people come in, and with them their families and people coming just as settlers, like myself, and people just, it's part of America. There's freedom to move in and out, and so what happens is that the people who were the descendants of the subjects of the kingdom became overwhelmed with these other people, and primarily white Americans, but also people from other nations too, and then our own local people began to develop more and more, and so finally, when we come to a point where when the vote is taken, the vote is taken by not the descendants of the kingdom, but by everybody that's here.
Let's take. Sometimes I get so carried away by listening about the things that happen, and our audience may not be having worked on these matters so intently that I want to take a few steps back just to be clear about what we are really talking about. There's a word that I often use. Some people don't like big words, but sometimes I find it big enough so that it acts like an umbrella. And it's called transmigration, where you have huge populations moving from place to place across borders. It may be over a slower period of time, but they're still moving that population across these places. One of the habits of colonizers is that they claim that they own or they have the right to dominate over a territory. So you have in that territory generally the indigenous people or the people that they find there, and now that they have declared that this is our territory, we get our population, and anyone else who would like to be associated with us, they can transmigrate into the other territory. When the United Nations says that people should have the right to self-determination, it was not all of the people within the territory, but it was the people who didn't have that right or had that right stolen from them. They are the guys and the girls who should have the right to make the choices.
That's right.
But what has happened is that the colonizer has instead, because they are the ones who actually operate how the choice or the exercise of self-determination is to be made, they manipulate who can participate in the exercise of self-determination.
Yes.
Not only do they manipulate that way, but the people that they find in the territory, they take over the schools, they take over the media, they take over all economic activity, and they begin a program of essentially brainwashing, or a nicer word is re-acculturating them to American ideas.
Yeah.
So when we went to school as children, we don't know anything else, and the teacher says, okay, stand and pledge your allegiance to the American flag, and then sing the American songs, and that all of that breeds within us this idea that, oh, we're supposed to be correct, appropriate, and be loyal to the foreigner. So that kind of breeding has changed the society. And I think that's perhaps another approach or explanation or view of what you are talking about.
Yes.
So they simply change the society.
But I really want to get back to trying to name the 4 or 5 things that are real problems with statehood vote, and the real problem we're trying to talk about here. And we'll get back to yours because it enters into another discussion. But the wrong people voted. I mean, you know, we're talking about who should have voted in the statehood vote. And it should have been the descendants of the kingdom, because those are the people who specifically are talked about in the charter. These are the people who are supposed to be decolonized. And so the people who should have been should have been voting should have been these very people. When you come and allow the other people to vote, you then you've got the wrong people voting, and that's such a major point. The wrong people voting. I'd like to go on to the next point.
Take it away.
Okay. You were talking about the way that they came in and just changed everybody around and so forth. Okay. I can't quite find that thing that I'm trying to develop right now. Go ahead and talk for a minute.
Thank you. It's called some people call it the brainwashing process, the acculturation process. How to make you become good American citizens, and so that issue of loyalty and allegiance to their country comes into play, and we who have been bred into, who have been subject to, victimized by this kind of activities, we become the first to join in the military. We become the first to be so willing to go to war and all that stuff without really understanding what has happened to us. Take as an example the Bishop Estate Kamehameha schools. The obligation there is to teach the youth to be good and industrious citizens. But after the overthrow, they have taken that language and they have said to teach them to become good and industrious American citizens.
Yes.
So,
The point that I was wanted to develop in relationship to this is that you have to have, in order to have a free vote, you have to have knowledge. You have to have an understanding of reality as it is. You have to be informed, and the things that you were saying, where they have come in and changed the whole education system and so forth, to where when we get to the vote, you don't have the information to make a valid vote. That's terribly important. I mean, people who have lived here a long time know that what happened in the schools, and then they know that, even when I was began teaching high school, there were the way that the whole history of Hawaii was handled was you had in a lower grade in grade school you learned about the kings and queens, and that ended with Queen Liliuokalani, and then she was gloriously reigning on the throne. And then the next place that you pick up is with the territory and modern Hawaiian history. And you go on with us as the people of the territory. And there's never any mention of the ugly overthrow. Mm-hmm. And so people like you grew up, joined the military, went off to war, and, believing in America being so virtuous and the cause of America because we are so good, and yet, and so you didn't have the knowledge when you came to vote that, hey, my queen was overthrown by these guys I'm voting for, I mean, that's criminal. You cannot make a free choice vote and honestly have free choice if you do not have the information to make a fully informed free choice. And that's point number 2 about the statehood vote. I mean, it's invalid because people did not have were not fully informed.
The way you make it appear is that the people who voted really didn't know what the opportunities, the choices, what had happened in the history, and what the opportunities were. But the thing is, it wasn't only us commoners, us makainana. The so-called leaders of the Hawaii society at that time themselves were just as ignorant because they were so much into the American system. Let me mention 2 names to you. Both of them, William or Bill.
Yeah. I was going to ask you to tell this story. So.
Thank you.
So no, it's good. Go on.
So you have William Quinn, who many people may recall, or if you have done some historical research, you'll find that he was appointed by President Eisenhower as the governor of the territory of Hawaii. So you can see the very colonial relationship, the governor of this place. And he was to carry out the responsibilities of the United States as the governor. The other William is William Richardson, native Hawaiian, comes from a strong Hawaiian family, closely aligned with Queen Liliuokalani. But then goes off to law school, comes back, engages in politics, becomes so fully Americanized that he does not even take a look at the history of Hawaii and the implications that it has to the right to self-determination. He becomes the Supreme Court Justice for Hawaii for 10 years. Very influential. He was head of the Democratic Party in 1959. William Quinn was a titular head of the Republican Party in 1959. The vote was taken in 1959. William Quinn was the official representative of the United States government, the appointee of the President of the United States. So when I spoke with them, both of them, approximately 30 years after statehood, and I asked them, what happened and why did you folks fail to provide our people with a full choice of self-determination, the right to choose independence as one of the options, as is required by United Nations documents? And their response was, we didn't know. This is the first time, William Quinn says, this is the first time I have ever heard about this. Where did you get all this information from? Hey, I was in the 8th grade at that time. You were the governor of the territory. Don't blame me for coming up with the information. So it's sometimes what happens is that when people don't like the information, they don't blame the fact that they are ignorant about the information. They blame the person who told them the information. So the ignorance pervaded the society. But coming back to the point that you said, if there is no informed consent, then there is no such thing as consent. If the vote was taken but the people did not know what their rights were, what their choices were, the vote itself is illegitimate.
That's right.
And so that's the point that you were, again, trying to get.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Since we've been talking about William Quinn and the ballot question, let's realize also that the ballot question itself was the wrong ballot question. And that because of that, it was an illegal vote. Let me just read here. UN Resolution 742 in 1953 declares that one of the factors indicative of the attainment of independence or of other separate systems of self-government is freedom of choosing between several possibilities, including independence. You can't have a ballot that is a legal ballot according to the United Nations when you're talking about self-governance without mentioning independence. And this was 1953. The vote was 1959. You have the wrong question. What was the question? You have the question in your mind. Tell me, what was the question on the ballot?
The question was, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? Mm-hmm. And the responses that were available was yes or no.
Mm-hmm. And thus your question to Governor Quinn, saying, where was the other question?
Where's independence?
And I want to go back to the thing about Quinn, though. Quinn answered you very honestly. Hey, I've never heard of such a thing. Why? Why did he not hear? Because the United States was keeping that from him. I mean, he was not involved in the United Nations. He knew. He should have known some things about the United Nations, but does he know all these fine little details that we find documentation Arnie was that provided, and saying that there were people who were involved with the United Nations at the time in the highest positions of government in the State Department who knew all this stuff. Who were pushing the United Nations in the other direction and sure weren't about to share that knowledge with anybody. I mean, you could have a case that the United States actually hid this knowledge from people so that they could manipulate them.
I think there's enough documentation. Now we can find it. We know how to research into UN libraries and things like that to show that it was a collusion. It was a conspiracy among people within the U.S. State Department to fashion the process that they took Hawaii as well as Alaska into the United Nations to sort of essentially take away our rights.
Yeah.
Yeah. William Quinn was regarded as a excellent attorney in Hawaii. But you have attorneys who can do wills and trusts and contracts and criminal law, but international arena is somewhat of a specialized arena that a lot of times people don't want to even step into. And they say, oh, that's international law, that's not domestic law, so we need not be regard that. But you see what happens when you shut your eyes to a huge area and they just sweep away your total rights, your right to self-determination, your right to freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, shall we go on to the next point?
Okay, let's see. I can't think of anything. The discussion that was had with William Quinn and William Richardson was done on public television. The fact, excuse me, the fact that these two men have passed on does not mean that the information is gone.
That's right.
Because it's a public record.
Yeah.
And so what we have done is we have unearthed the transcripts and we have used the words of these people to also support the case on why the actions taken was inappropriate.
Very good. Very good. As long as we're mentioning that, I do want to say that, that was a television program which you were on with William Richardson and William Quinn, and also with Mahilani
Kamau
Yeah.
at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that, and it was, who was the moderator at the time?
He was a professor of political science, Dan Boylan.
Dan Boylan, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. As long as we're giving, let me also mention Arnie Psyche and the fact that Arnie has done so much work on this and has material on the computer that people can get to. And his work is really invaluable, and I'm so grateful for him being a part of helping us to put this whole stuff together.
Okay. So go ahead. You had
I'm just moving ahead.
Is this a time to talk about? So what do we do with this information?
No, we still got 2 more points.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you for correcting.
Okay.
Correcting me.
Okay. The next point that we need to be aware of is that they switched the meaning of full measure of self-governance. The whole idea, if we back up, as far as statehood was concerned, statehood was the whole statehood vote came about because the United Nations was saying to the nations who had invaded and colonized other nations that they needed to educate the people for total self-governance, and they had to give them the opportunity to choose self-governance. And so, the thing is that what self-governance means is decolonization. But in the case of Hawaii, they changed the meaning of self-governance, and instead of becoming independent, they became absorbed as a state, and so you got the total switch here, and it's because you've got the wrong people voting too, I mean, if you had just the descendants of the kingdom, that would be all the Japanese, Portuguese, Chinese, Hawaiians, Haoles, people who were part of the kingdom as subjects of the kingdom. Okay, if you had the descendants of the kingdom, that's the people who should have voted. Instead, we had them overwhelmed with numbers, just burgeoning numbers of people who were super pro-American, including the entire military. You know,
the military could vote.
the military could vote. Yes, and what age? 20. I thought it was 21 at that time. No, but 20. Yeah. Okay. So 20, you had to be 20. You had to live here for a year. So if you were in the military and you'd been here for a year, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of people. You know, the vote was 134,000 people took that vote. We'll get around to that in a few minutes here. But instead of having the idea of independence for the people who were colonized, they switched things so that everybody votes, and we talk about what are we going to have for self-governance? Oh, we're going to move into becoming a state. But nothing changed, no? You're good at that. Why don't you talk about nothing changed? Go ahead.
I'm going to argue the American side.
Oh, okay.
Because what you did receive was greater freedoms. Now, instead of the governor being appointed by the President of the United States, you can actually elect your own governor.
One change.
Instead of the judges of all of your courts being appointed by the United States, you can now have your state of Hawaii appoint their own judges without the president stepping in.
Good.
So these are freedoms that you have. Now you have the freedom of voting for the President of the United States. So you see expanded freedoms. This is what we give you.
How good of you. How good of you. Now, and however, you know, everything else stays the same. I mean, you know, we've got the same people telling the military they can come in. We've got the same people, and now our government is the United States, and we're a state, and so we can say, okay, yeah, sure.
You have
and people moving in, population, migration. No, that's the way it is in the United States. You know?
So you have the hovering over of the U.S. Constitution over the islands. So when you ask, well, does the freedom also include my freedom to trade with any country that we wish to? No, we reserve that for the Congress. Does my freedom contain the right to prevent the continuing transmigration of foreigners into Hawaii so that we can control our population? No, that one we have reserved. Does my freedom include my right to refuse to finance the continual occupation of the United States into Hawaii? Oh, no, you have to pay the fair share. And you can go through all of these different things. Does my freedom include the right to determine our own foreign policy? No, that is ours. So the trickery is how the U.S. continually defines or redefines international terms like self-determination and changes it to meet just the Americanized definition of the term. Even the term sovereignty, they have taken that term and they have said, well, American Indians have sovereignty within the definitions of the Supreme Court and what the U.S. Congress gives to them. But we still call it sovereignty. So that's the idea of being careful with the use of terms that how Americans have used it. Okay, that's all.
That's great. Thank you. So at any rate, what we're saying then is that they changed the meaning of the full measure of self-governance to, instead of we're talking about becoming self-governing, instead we're absorbed into the United States. So, and then let's go on to the last thing that we want to talk about, and that is the number of people who voted. Now we know that 94% of the people of Hawaii support statehood. Right?
According to the report.
Wrong. Okay, you know, when we really look more carefully into this, that's only counting the yes and no votes. What we don't count is the 18% of ballots that were left unmarked. You know, unmarked is a no vote. Okay. And so when we get down to it, if you count those no votes, then we have 77% of the people voting for statehood. Now this just happened in Macedonia the other day. They had a vote about whether they're going to call themselves North Macedonia or not. It's probably the biggest vote in their history. Well, this was the biggest vote in our history. And how many people voted for changing the name? 96%. Sounds an awful lot like our 94%. But there was another little statistic there in Macedonia which is causing an awful lot of consternation right now, and that is only 35% of the people voted. Only 35% of the people voted. What does that mean? That means 65% of the people voted with their feet, and they said, nope, I'm not going to be walking down there at all, because I'm not supporting that. Now, if we take a look at Hawaii, 364,000 people, I think it was, are eligible to vote by age. Okay, 300, and how many voted? 134, I think, something like that. What we've got is 35% of the people voted for sovereignty, for statehood. 35% of the people voted for statehood, not 94%. 35%. The rest voted against it, either by ballot or with their feet. Yeah.
Amazing how you can play with numbers. I don't mean to rush you.
Go ahead.
But because of the time, can you tell me, taking all of these and even more information about illegalities that have occurred, where do we go from here?
I think the action that we're taking right now is trying to make the United Nations aware of this. We're trying to make them aware that this is just part of the picture. There is the bigger picture of the history up until the time of statehood. How were we treated? Were we treated in accordance with the
standards
and the charter itself? The regulations of the charter. And the answer is no. I just want to say really quickly that when the vote was taken, then the United States went to the United Nations and said, our people have voted for statehood. And the United Nations went along with it in spite of the fact that all of these things were true. And they knew some of them to be, false. What we want to do is we want to be able to go to the United Nations and say to them, hey, this is what really was. Now, you're not just colonizers anymore like you were back at the time of statehood, primarily colonizing countries. You are a country, you are primarily people who have been decolonized. We want you to look at us, We should have been decolonized too. We weren't, you were. Help us out. Help us out.
So essentially we're saying that a fraud was committed against not only the people of Hawaii, who had the right to self-determination with all of these choices, but when the report was given to the United Nations in 1959, and they said, okay, congratulations to the United States, we'll take Hawaii off the list of places to be decolonized, a fraud was actually being committed against the United Nations as well.
Yes.
So today we go back to the United Nations. Let's say if we can get some countries to agree with us. We are essentially asking them to reconsider the action that they took in 1959.
Yes.
Recognize that a fraud was committed at that point and have the question reopened as to whether or not Hawaii and the appropriate self, the appropriate people, wants to choose among these opportunities. First, with education, being careful who participates in the vote. Don't let the foreign military come in and vote in our election, all that kind of stuff. And let's see if the people of Hawaii wants to be able to create their own society, their own governing system, and have control over their own future. What is the probability that the United Nations will re-inscribe, as we say, or put Hawaii back on the list of places to be decolonized, we only have 2 minutes. So let me point this out. The world changes. Just as the UN has increased to, what is that, 193, 96 members from about 46, 47 back when they formed. And you have a very interesting yellow-haired individual who goes to the United Nations every year, and he represents the United States at the United Nations. And he is probably the most effective speaker to assist the United Nations to come to the realization that the United States may not all be sane. They laugh at him as he gives his speech about how great he is, the greatest person ever to come to the United Nations. That may have a tendency to sort of urge members of the United Nations to say, hey, wait a minute, is it really worth all of the military bases and the foreign aid that we think we're getting for free and having to put up with this kind of shenanigans that is going on by the United States across the world? Or is it time that we put a stop to it and say, let us return to principles, the right of self-determination? So I think there is opportunity and there is hope for us to getting our story told respectfully, appropriately, truthfully.
I think so too. I think that President Trump has helped us considerably. I think that the United Nations, they did laugh at him, and they enjoyed that, and that could be very helpful to us. I think that there's more than that, though. I think that there is all of the truth that we've exposed, and I think that they have been lied to in the past, and I think that at that time they were plenty willing to accept that, but I don't think they're willing to do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for bringing all this information to us and to our audience here.
Let me say that we've worked it out together along with Leon and with some input from Arnie Psyche. And Leon, see you, by the way, who is not with us today.
Our time is up. Thank you for joining us. Aloha. We'll be back next month with another edition of the Solid Conversation. Mahalo.